The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that felt rehearsed, maintained, as if every bird and barking dog had been given instructions on when and where to exist. The rows of houses in Willow Creek shined like they had been painted yesterday, each lawn mowed to the exact same height, every hedge clipped like a soldier's haircut. To most, it was paradise. To James Rourke, it was suffocation wrapped in green grass and smug smiles. James had lived in Willow Creek for 3 years, ever since he sold the small farm he kept after leaving the Army. Retirement was supposed to be peace, but peace here was an illusion of control. The Homeowners Association demanded perfection, rules stacked on rules, enforced by a man who thought himself a general in a suburban war. Gerald Mason, the HOA president, wore his authority like medals pinned to his chest. He spoke with the smugness of someone who never had to crawl through mud or watch a friend bleed out in a ditch. He commanded with newsletters, violation fines, and passive-aggressive notes taped to doors. Gerald's lawn was his crown jewel. Perfect emerald blades, trimmed an exact 2 inches, watered at dawn and dusk, the sprinkler heads spinning like artillery placements across his property. He would stand there in the evenings, hands on his hips, nodding with pride as neighbors walked past, silently judging anyone whose grass grew uneven or browned under the sun. To Gerald, the lawn wasn't just grass. It was status. It was power. James watched all of this from his porch, sipping coffee so black it tasted like the memory of gunpowder. He didn't hate order. The military had been built on order. But Gerald's order was different. It wasn't about survival or discipline. It was about ego. And after 3 years of warnings and fines, James's mailbox too rustic, his American flag a fraction too faded, his flower bed not aligned with HOA aesthetics, something in James began to simmer. The final straw came in July. Gerald marched up to James's porch, clipboard in hand, tie knotted tight despite the summer heat. "Mr. Rourke," Gerald began, already smirking, "I'm afraid your grass has grown 1/8 of an inch beyond regulation height. We can't have disorder setting in. It lowers property values." James leaned back in his chair, silent, eyes narrowing like he had once done while scanning enemy ridgelines. "I'll give you until Saturday," Gerald continued, scribbling on his paper, "or I'll have no choice but to issue a violation notice." Again, he gave a curt nod, turned, and walked away, his shoes clicking on the pavement like a metronome of arrogance. James stared at the back of his head, a plan already forming in the part of his brain that had once calculated patrol routes and supply lines. He had no family, no commanding officer, no one to answer to now. But the discipline remained, the patience of a man who could wait weeks for the right moment. That night, James stood at his window. Across the street, Gerald's lawn glowed under carefully placed solar lights, green and smug even under the stars. James thought about the men he'd served with, the sacrifices they made, the ridiculousness of being hounded over grass. He thought about Gerald's smug face, about the hypocrisy of someone who had never sacrificed a thing demanding perfection from others. By morning, the decision was made. James wasn't going to fight Gerald in the way most neighbors tried, with complaints or arguments at HOA meetings. No, James would use the skills that had been drilled into him years ago. Quiet, precise, untraceable. The sabotage began with reconnaissance. For 3 days, James observed Gerald's routines. He learned when the sprinklers switched on, how long the water cycle lasted, when Gerald trimmed, fertilized, and even when the lawn service crew arrived. Gerald was consistent, predictable, a man who thrived on patterns. Patterns could be exploited. James purchased supplies in small amounts at different stores across town. A gallon of vinegar here, a bag of salt there, gloves for a hardware store 3 neighborhoods over. To anyone else, they were harmless household items. To James, they were weapons of subtle destruction. The first strike was minor. On a Tuesday night, while most of Willow Creek slept, James slipped across the street dressed in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. He moved silently, like he had on night raids decades earlier, though his knees protested with each crouch. He sprinkled a light dusting of salt along the edges of Gerald's lawn, careful not to overdo it. The effect wouldn't show immediately, but within days, the grass along the borders began to yellow, as though nature itself had decided Gerald's perfection was flawed. Neighbors noticed. Gerald, flustered, called in his lawn service twice in 1 week, paying extra for treatments. James watched from his porch, expression unreadable, as Gerald barked orders at the crew, demanding results. But James wasn't done. Sabotage wasn't about one strike. It was about wearing down, creating doubt, making the enemy question themselves. The second strike came a week later. James tampered with the sprinkler system, loosening a connection so that one of the heads sprayed unevenly. The effect was subtle. Patches of Gerald's lawn became overwatered, muddy, while others grew dry and brittle. Gerald cursed at the malfunction, calling the installer, demanding urgent repairs. The satisfaction James felt wasn't joy. It wasn't even revenge, not exactly. It was justice in its own crooked form. He wasn't killing a man, wasn't pulling a trigger. He was reminding Gerald that control was an illusion, that perfection could crumble with the smallest push. One evening, Gerald knocked on James's door. "Have you noticed anything unusual?" Gerald asked, shifting uneasily. For the first time, he looked less like a general and more like a man losing a battle. "Someone's tampering with my property. Sabotage. Maybe kids, maybe vandals. But if you see anything..." James kept his face still, his voice calm. "Haven't seen a thing, but I'll keep an eye out." Gerald nodded, suspicious but desperate, and left. James closed the door slowly, the faintest smirk breaking through his weathered features. Part of him wondered if he should stop, but another part, the part that remembered every humiliation Gerald had inflicted, told him he was just getting started. The third strike was bolder. James waited until a stormy night when thunder covered noise and rain masked movement. He carried a small sprayer filled with his vinegar mixture and misted it across several sections of Gerald's lawn. By morning, the rain had washed away most evidence of tampering. Within days, irregular patches appeared, brown scars across the once perfect green. Gerald was furious. He argued with contractors, accused teenagers, even spoke at an HOA meeting about acts of domestic terrorism against our community standards. James sat quietly in the back row, sipping water, eyes calm but watchful. It was working. Gerald was unraveling. His lawn, his pride, his symbol of power was slipping from his grasp, and he had no idea who the enemy was. James knew the war wasn't over. Sabotage, like combat, required escalation, precision, patience. He wasn't just dismantling grass. He was dismantling a man's illusion of control, one blade at a time. And as he sat on his porch one cool evening, watching Gerald pace his yard with growing desperation, James felt Adelfield had changed, but the mission remained the same: weaken the enemy, break their will, and win without ever being caught. The following weeks became a careful dance between Gerald's desperate attempts to maintain control and James's quiet precision. Each day, James woke with a renewed sense of mission. He would sip his coffee, read the paper, and then, from behind the shield of his porch, watch Gerald stumble through his unraveling kingdom of grass. Neighbors began whispering. Gerald's once envied lawn now looked sickly, patchy, unreliable. Some joked about how even the lawn king couldn't beat the August heat. Others suspected sabotage, though no one dared voice it loudly. Gerald himself grew more paranoid, installing cameras along his fence, pacing at odd hours, even setting motion lights that flashed at squirrels and passing cars. James observed all of it with the calmness of a veteran on Overwatch. Cameras could be fooled. Lights could be avoided. Gerald was playing defense, and James had always known defense was the weaker game. The next strike required timing. Gerald's pride wasn't just in the grass, but in the HOA tours he led for potential homebuyers. He'd strut down the sidewalks with couples, gesturing grandly to the pristine rows of houses, always pausing longest at his own lawn. To him, it was living proof that his rules worked. James decided to target one of those tours. The night before, he crept across the street, carrying a small container of powdered sugar and flour mixed with yeast. He sprinkled it carefully in uneven patches, knowing the morning dew would activate it. By noon, Gerald's lawn was dotted with strange, fungal blooms, pale blotches that looked diseased under the sun. When Gerald led the couple past his property, his face tightened. The husband asked, "What happened there?" "Fungus," Gerald stammered, insisting it was temporary, that professionals were already handling it. But James could see the perfection had been broken. That evening, Gerald shouted at the lawn service crew until his voice cracked. He dug into the soil himself, sweating in his polo shirt, muttering under his breath. From across the street, James sat with his coffee, still as a statue. The sabotage was no longer just about grass. It was psychological. Each failed attempt to restore order chipped away at Gerald's composure. The man who once handed out fines with smug certainty now carried himself like a soldier losing a war he never trained for. But James knew he couldn't grow reckless. In combat, overconfidence killed. He had to remain careful, invisible, as if nothing in the world concerned him. One afternoon, Gerald knocked on his door again. This time, he looked tired. "James, I know you said you hadn't seen anything, but you used to be military, right? You know tactics. Someone's targeting me. Someone's attacking my property. You must have noticed something." James let silence stretch before answering. "Your grass looks sick, Gerald. Could just be nature. Not everything is an attack." Gerald's eyes narrowed. For a moment, James wondered if suspicion had finally landed where it belonged. But then Gerald shook his head, muttered something about calling the police, and stormed off. The police came the next day, walking the property, shrugging at Gerald's complaints. No footprints, no witnesses, nothing to file. Gerald argued until his face turned red, but the officers left uninterested. That night, James allowed himself the faintest chuckle. Gerald was losing allies. Soon, his paranoia would make him look like the very thing he despised, an outsider disrupting harmony. Still, James wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He never touched Gerald's home, his car, or anything beyond the lawn. The mission was focused, disciplined. It wasn't about destruction. It was about breaking ego. The climax came in September. The HOA planned its annual neighborhood contest, awarding a small trophy and bragging rights to the best lawn. Gerald had won for 5 consecutive years. To him, it wasn't just tradition, it was destiny. He was certain he would win again, despite the recent setbacks. He doubled his efforts, bringing in new contractors, layering chemicals, watering obsessively. His lawn improved, but James had one last move prepared. The night before the judging, James waited until the street fell silent. He moved carefully, avoiding cameras he had already mapped out. From a thermos, he poured a diluted solution of sugar water across strategic patches of Gerald's grass. It wouldn't kill anything outright, but by morning, ants swarmed in thick trails, drawn to the sweetness. They covered sections of the lawn like black rivers. When the judges arrived, clipboards in hand, Gerald's lawn was alive with insects. He tried to shoo them, hose them, even stomp at them, but the sight was unforgettable. The neighbors whispered, some amused, some shocked. Gerald's face turned crimson as the judges moved on. That evening, the announcement came. Gerald Mason, for the first time in years, had lost the trophy. Instead, the award went to a quiet couple down the street, whose modest yard had flourished without fuss. The applause was polite, but filled with a quiet satisfaction. Gerald stormed off before the ceremony ended. James sat in his chair, watching the sun dip low, the trophy carried past his porch in unfamiliar hands. For the first time since he moved into Willow Creek, the neighborhood felt alive, human, imperfect. The days that followed showed a changed Gerald. He no longer strutted in the evenings. His newsletters grew shorter, less sharp. The fines slowed. His lawn still bore scars, though he fought to restore it. But the shine was gone from his pride. The man who once commanded with smugness now walked like someone aware the world could tilt beneath his feet at any moment. James kept his silence. He never boasted, never hinted, never revealed his hand. To him, it wasn't about credit. It was about balance. In the quiet of his porch, he reflected on how wars were never really won by who shouted loudest, but by who endured, who adapted, who struck with precision when it mattered most. Sometimes he wondered if he had gone too far, if perhaps Gerald had simply been a small man clinging to the little power he could hold. But then James remembered the notes taped to his door, the fines over faded flags, the arrogance of a man blind to other struggles. And he reminded himself, some lessons had to be taught the hard way. As autumn settled in, the lawns of Willow Creek grew less perfect. A few neighbors let their hedges grow wilder. Others planted flowers without asking permission. For once, there was color beyond uniform green. And though Gerald still lived across the street, his grip on the neighborhood had loosened. One crisp October evening, James sat back in his chair, a blanket over his knees, coffee steaming in his hand. The war was over. There were no medals, no reports, no grand speeches. Just a quiet victory, grass blades bending under the breeze, a neighborhood finally breathing without a tyrant's chokehold. James closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the world, the distant hum of cars, the chirp of crickets, the laughter of children playing past curfew. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not the suffocating order Gerald had enforced, but real peace. Messy, unpredictable, human. And though no one else would ever know, James allowed himself one small smile. The veteran had fought his final battle, not with bullets or bombs, but with patience, precision, and a quiet rebellion against arrogance. The battlefield was a suburban lawn, the enemy a man blinded by pride, and the victory, sweet and silent, was his alone.